Clean the bathroom before dinner, and don't touch anything upstairs, my daughter-in-law said the moment I stepped into my son's house carrying a peach cobbler I had spent 3 hours baking for my grandson's birthday. My son Daniel didn't even look up from his laptop. He just adjusted his glasses and said, "Mom, Vanessa's been stressed lately. Just help out a little, okay?" I stood there near the entryway holding the warm glass dish against my chest, while the smell of lemon cleaner drifted through the hallway. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I had heard her wrong. Vanessa crossed her arms and pointed toward the downstairs bathroom with long pale fingers. "The toilet still has stains around the base," she said flatly. "And please use the old towels under the sink. The white ones are decorative." I looked down at my shoes. I had driven almost 90 miles from Hartford to spend the weekend with my son and grandson. The peach cobbler was still warm. I could smell cinnamon and butter through the foil. 10 years ago, Daniel used to beg me to make that same recipe every Thanksgiving. Back then he used to hug me before I even reached the front porch. Now he barely glanced at me. "Of course," I whispered quietly, though my throat felt strangely tight. Vanessa handed me a pair of yellow rubber gloves like she was assigning duties to hotel staff. Her wedding ring caught the kitchen light as she turned away from me. "And please don't wander upstairs," she added casually. "Some rooms are private." Private. The word stayed with me as I walked toward the bathroom carrying the gloves in my trembling hands. My own son's house suddenly felt colder than the December air outside. I passed framed family photos along the hallway wall. Vanessa smiling on the beach. My grandson Ethan holding a baseball trophy. Daniel standing beside a new SUV in their driveway. There wasn't a single photo of me anywhere. Not one. The downstairs bathroom smelled sharply of bleach and eucalyptus. I slowly placed my purse beside the sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. At 69 years old, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. My silver hair had become thinner this past year after Richard died. Grief changes a person quietly. It hollows you out little by little until even your own face feels unfamiliar. I pulled on the gloves without another word. Upstairs, I could hear faint laughter. Ethan's voice. Vanessa's heels moving across hardwood floors. Then Daniel laughing too. Something about that sound hurt more than I expected. I scrubbed the sink carefully while warm tears gathered in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Richard used to tell me something whenever life became difficult. "Never let anyone confuse your kindness for weakness, Maggie." I repeated those words silently as I wiped the countertop clean. When I finished, I reached for one of the old towels under the sink just like Vanessa instructed. That was when I noticed a cardboard box shoved deep into the cabinet corner. My name was written across the top in black marker. Margaret Whitmore. My stomach tightened instantly. I slowly pulled the box toward me and lifted the lid just enough to see what was inside. Old photo albums. My winter coat. Framed pictures from my house. And sitting right on top was the brass key to my own front door. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the brass key lying on top of my folded cardigan like some kind of silent warning. The keychain still had the small wooden heart Richard carved for me during our 20th anniversary trip to Vermont. My fingers tightened around the edge of the box as a strange heaviness settled into my chest. They had packed my things already. Not someday. Not eventually. Already. I slowly lowered the lid and pushed the box back beneath the sink just as footsteps approached down the hallway. Vanessa stopped in the doorway holding her phone in one hand. "Oh good," she said without smiling. "You found the cleaning supplies." I removed the gloves carefully and placed them beside the faucet. "Why are my belongings in that box?" I asked quietly. For the first time all afternoon, Vanessa looked slightly uncomfortable. It lasted less than a second. "Daniel thought it would be easier if we organized some things while you are here," she replied. "Your house is too much responsibility for someone your age." Anyway, someone your age. I noticed how casually she said it now, as if 69 automatically meant helpless. I reached for my purse and straightened my coat sleeve slowly. "I did not ask anyone to organize my home," I said. Vanessa gave a small shrug and leaned against the doorway. "Well, honestly, Margaret, somebody has to start thinking ahead. Daniel worries about you living alone." I almost laughed at that. Daniel had not called me in nearly 3 weeks before inviting me here for Ethan's birthday dinner. 3 weeks. Yet suddenly he was deeply concerned about my future. Upstairs, Ethan's laughter echoed again, followed by music from a television commercial. For one painful moment, I remembered another birthday long ago. Daniel turning 8 years old in our old colonial house outside Hartford. Richard hanging streamers over the dining room while I frosted a baseball cake from scratch. Daniel had run downstairs in dinosaur pajamas and wrapped both arms around my waist before sunrise because he could not wait to open his presents. Back then, I was the center of his world. Now I felt like an unwanted guest standing in someone else's hallway. Vanessa glanced at her phone screen. "Dinner is at 6, she said. "And please do not mention any stressful topics tonight. Ethan gets anxious easily." I looked directly at her then. "Do I make your son anxious, Vanessa?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "I just think stability matters for children." Before I could answer, Daniel finally appeared behind her carrying his laptop under one arm. "Hey Mom," he said quickly, avoiding my eyes again. "Did Vanessa show you the guest room downstairs?" "Guest room. Not your room. Not Mom's room. Just guest room." I nodded once. Daniel shifted awkwardly beside the staircase. There were dark circles beneath his eyes now. His shoulders looked tense beneath his sweater. For a brief second, he reminded me of Richard near the end of his illness. Exhausted, cornered by something he could not control. "We converted the upstairs office into Ethan's study area," Daniel explained too quickly. "Kids need structure these days." I studied my son carefully. He still could not hold eye contact with me. For more than a moment, that was when I realized something colder than anger. Daniel knew exactly what was happening inside this house. And worse than that, he was allowing it. Later that evening, while I unpacked my suitcase in the downstairs room beside the laundry area, I noticed something sitting quietly on the nightstand beside the lamp. A small orange prescription bottle with my name on it. Picked it up slowly. It was blood pressure medication. Medication I had never seen before in my life. I turned the prescription bottle slowly in my hands while the washing machine hummed softly through the wall beside the guest room. My name was printed clearly across the label in bold black letters. Margaret Whitmore. The medication was supposedly for memory support and mild cognitive decline. I read the words 3 separate times before the meaning fully settled into my chest like cold rain. Cognitive decline. My fingers tightened around the orange bottle. I had never been diagnosed with memory problems in my life. My family doctor in Hartford still called me one of his healthiest patients for my age. I managed my own finances, drove myself across 3 states every summer, and volunteered twice a week at the church food pantry. Yet here was a prescription sitting quietly beside my bed as if it belonged there. As if somebody had already decided who I was becoming. A sharp knock startled me before the door opened halfway. Vanessa leaned inside carrying folded towels. "Oh good," she said when she noticed the bottle in my hand. Dr. Klein finally approved the refill. I stared at her carefully. "What refill?" Her expression remained calm, almost rehearsed. "Daniel told me your memory issues have been getting worse lately." She stepped farther into the room and placed the towels neatly on the dresser. "You forgot your neighbor Evelyn's birthday last month. And you left your stove on twice." I blinked at her slowly. "I have never left my stove on." Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "Margaret, there is no shame in aging. We are only trying to help you." Help. That word sounded uglier every time she used it. I placed the bottle back on the nightstand very carefully. Because suddenly I understood something deeply unsettling. None of this was accidental. The packed boxes. The guest room downstairs. The comments about my age. The medication. They were building a story around me piece by piece. A story where I became forgetful, fragile, and incapable of living alone. Vanessa gave me a patient smile that never reached her eyes. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said softly. "And maybe tonight let Daniel handle the conversations. Sometimes you repeat yourself without realizing it." She closed the door before I could answer. I sat motionless at the edge of the bed after she left. Upstairs, cabinet doors opened and closed while Ethan laughed at something on television. Normal sounds. Ordinary family sounds. Yet every noise in that house suddenly felt staged somehow. Like I had walked into a play where everybody already knew the ending except me. I slowly opened my purse and removed my reading glasses. Then I pulled out the small leather notebook I had carried for years after Richard passed away. He used to joke that I documented life better than a court reporter. Grocery lists, doctor appointments, mileage records, every detail neatly written in blue ink. My stove maintenance check from last winter, notes from church meetings, lunch dates with Evelyn, entire months carefully documented in my own handwriting. Not the work of a confused woman losing her memory. I opened to the page from last month and froze. Written clearly beside Evelyn's birthday lunch was a note in red ink. Cancelled by Vanessa. Said Daniel was busy. My stomach tightened immediately. I flipped backward through earlier pages. More cancellations. More changed plans. Family dinners suddenly postponed. Doctor appointments Vanessa insisted on attending with me. Tiny interruptions scattered across my life so quietly I had barely noticed them before. But now, sitting alone in that basement guest room beside a bottle of medication I had never requested, I finally understood the truth. Someone inside this house was slowly trying to erase me before I was even gone. That night, long after dinner ended and the house finally grew quiet, I sat alone on the edge of the narrow guest bed staring at the old digital clock beside the lamp. It was almost midnight. I could hear the faint sound of rain tapping softly against the basement window near the ceiling. The room smelled like fabric softener and dust. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked beneath slow footsteps before silence returned again. I rested my hands in my lap and tried to steady my breathing, but my thoughts kept circling the same terrible realization. They were preparing to take control of my life one careful step at a time. Not with shouting. Not with cruelty obvious enough for outsiders to notice. But quietly. Politely. The way people remove furniture from a room one piece at a time until suddenly the space no longer belongs to you. I closed my eyes and thought about Richard. Whenever life became confusing, my mind still reached for him automatically, even after 2 years without him beside me. I could still picture him standing in our kitchen every Sunday morning wearing his old Yale sweatshirt while coffee brewed behind him. He always woke before sunrise no matter how late he stayed up the night before. House feels different before everybody else wakes up, he used to say. You can hear the truth better in the quiet. Back then I did not fully understand what he meant. Now I did. Richard noticed things other people missed. Tiny changes in behavior. Forced smiles. Silences that lasted too long. About 6 months before his heart attack, he had sat beside me on our back porch during a thunderstorm and said something strange completely out of nowhere. If anything ever happens to me, promise me you will never let anyone make decisions for you, just because you are grieving. I remembered laughing softly at the time. Richard, who would do that? He had stared out at the rain for several seconds before answering. People do strange things when property and comfort are involved, Maggie. At the time I thought he was simply being protective. Richard had always worried too much about me. But now, sitting alone in that basement room while my belongings sat packed inside cardboard boxes upstairs, his words no longer sounded paranoid. They sounded prophetic. I stood slowly and walked toward my suitcase near the dresser. Buried beneath my sweaters was the old cedar box Richard kept locked inside his office closet for nearly 20 years. After his funeral, I had almost thrown it away without opening it. Inside were insurance documents, military records, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's careful handwriting. Margaret, for when things stopped making sense. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the cedar box again for the first time in months. The envelope remained untouched exactly where I left it. I stared at it for a long moment before carefully sliding the letter out. The paper had yellowed slightly along the folds. Richard's handwriting looked steady and familiar across the page. Maggie, if you are reading this, it means somebody has started making you question yourself. Do not ignore your instincts. There are people who do not steal money first. They steal authority. They convince others you are confused, tired, emotional. Once they control the story about who you are, everything else becomes easier for them. I felt cold all over. Outside, thunder rumbled softly somewhere far beyond the neighborhood. I continued reading with shaking hands. You are stronger and sharper than you realize. And if Daniel ever loses sight of that, remember this clearly. I built protections around everything we worked for. Trust yourself before you trust anybody else. Even family. The next morning, I woke before sunrise after barely sleeping at all. The basement room felt colder in the early morning darkness, and for several quiet minutes I simply lay there listening to the soft rumble of pipes inside the walls. Upstairs, the house remained silent. I reached toward the nightstand and touched Richard's letter again, reassuring myself it had been real. Somehow his words had steadied me during the night. They reminded me that confusion was exactly what people like Vanessa depended on. If they could make me doubt myself long enough, eventually I would stop fighting back altogether. I dressed slowly and went upstairs before anyone else woke up. The kitchen windows overlooked the backyard where frost covered the grass like thin white powder. I started the coffee maker out of habit, measuring the grounds exactly the way Richard liked for 43 years. Some routines stay in your hands even after the people attached to them are gone. While the coffee brewed, I noticed a large white binder sitting on the kitchen counter beside Vanessa's tablet. Across the front was a printed label, Margaret Care Plan. My heartbeat slowed instantly. Carefully, I opened the binder just enough to glance at the first page. There were medication schedules, doctor appointment notes, lists of emergency contacts, and highlighted phrases that made my stomach tighten. Increased forgetfulness, difficulty managing household responsibilities, episodes of confusion. I stared at the words in disbelief. None of it was true. Footsteps sounded upstairs suddenly, and I closed the binder immediately just as Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing silk pajamas and a tight expression. She stopped cold when she saw me near the counter. "You are up early," she said carefully. "Could not sleep," I answered. I poured myself coffee while she watched me too closely. "I found your binder," I added calmly. Vanessa walked over without rushing. "Oh, that." She gave a soft laugh that sounded painfully artificial. "It is only something Daniel and I put together because we worry about you." I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "You documented episodes of confusion that never happened." Vanessa's face remained smooth and composed. "Margaret, sometimes people are the last to recognize changes in themselves." There it was again. Calm, polite, almost compassionate. If someone overheard her, they would think she was a loving daughter-in-law trying to protect an aging widow. That was the frightening part. Vanessa never raised her voice when she manipulated people. She wrapped cruelty inside concern so neatly it almost looked like kindness. Daniel entered the kitchen moments later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled before opening the refrigerator. Vanessa glanced toward him immediately. "Your mother found the care binder." Daniel froze briefly before forcing a tired smile. "Mom, it is not a big deal. Vanessa just likes to stay organized." Organized. As though preparing documents describing me as mentally unstable was perfectly normal family behavior. I looked directly at my son. "Did you tell doctors I was becoming forgetful?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside the refrigerator door. "We only mentioned a few concerns," he said quietly. "Like what?" He hesitated too long. Vanessa answered for him. "The missed appointments. The stove incident. The way you repeat stories." I set my coffee mug down carefully because suddenly I understood something even worse than the lies themselves. Daniel had started believing them. Maybe not fully. Maybe not completely. But little by little, day after day, Vanessa had repeated these stories until doubt began growing inside him like mold in a dark room. And doubt, once planted, spreads quietly. Ethan suddenly came running downstairs wearing dinosaur pajamas and carrying a stuffed bear under one arm. "Grandma!" he shouted happily before wrapping his arms around my waist. Instantly Vanessa stepped forward. "Ethan, sweetheart, remember what we talked about. Gentle hugs only. Grandma gets overwhelmed easily." I looked down at my grandson holding on to me while Vanessa watched carefully from across the kitchen. That was the moment something inside me finally hardened completely. Because now I understood this was not only about my house or my money anymore. Vanessa was rewriting who I was inside my own family. For the next 2 days I stopped arguing completely. I stopped questioning Vanessa's comments, stopped reacting when she corrected me in front of Ethan, and stopped trying to convince Daniel that I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. Instead I watched. Quietly. Carefully. The way Richard used to watch storms rolling in across the lake before anybody else noticed the clouds changing. Once I became silent, people around me became careless. Vanessa especially. On Tuesday afternoon, she asked me to fold laundry while she took Ethan to soccer practice. Daniel had already left for work downtown, and for the first time since arriving at their house, I was completely alone upstairs. The silence felt strange after days of walking on eggshells. I folded towels slowly at the dining room table while sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors. Near the kitchen counter, Vanessa's tablet lit up with an incoming email notification. I tried not to look at first. I truly did. But then I saw my own name in the subject line. Evaluation update regarding Margaret Whitmore. My hands went still instantly. After several long seconds, I stood up and walked toward the counter. The message preview remained visible across the screen. Dr. Klein agrees supervised living may soon be the safest option. I felt my pulse thudding heavily in my throat. Supervised living. Assisted care. They were not simply trying to help me anymore. They were preparing to remove me from my own life entirely. Before I could think better of it, I opened the email chain. There were dozens of messages between Vanessa, Dr. Klein's office, and someone named Rebecca Haynes from Silver Pines Senior Living Center outside Hartford. My chest tightened as I read line after line discussing me, as if I were not a real person at all. Increased confusion during conversations. Emotional dependency concerns. Difficulty maintaining independent routines. Recommendation for transition planning within 60 days. 60 days. They had already built a timeline for removing me from my home. One email stopped me cold. Vanessa had written it herself only 3 nights earlier. Daniel still feels guilty, but once Margaret is settled somewhere safe, we can finally move forward with listing the house. I read the sentence twice because part of me still could not fully believe my own son had allowed this to happen. My hand shook slightly as I returned the tablet exactly where it had been. Then I sat back down at the dining table and stared through the backyard windows while the clock above the stove ticked softly in the silence. Richard had been right. They were not stealing money first. They were stealing authority. Later that evening after dinner, Vanessa asked me to help clear plates while she packed Ethan's lunch for school. "You forgot where the silverware drawer was earlier," she said casually while rinsing grapes at the sink. "That kind of thing worries Daniel." I dried a dinner plate slowly with the kitchen towel. "No," I answered calmly. "I did not forget. You moved the silverware last week." Vanessa turned toward me with narrowed eyes for the briefest moment before smiling again. "See? That is exactly what I mean. Sometimes your memory fills in details differently." The cruelty of it almost impressed me. Every reality could be reshaped instantly. Every objection became proof against me. Daniel entered the kitchen halfway through the conversation carrying Ethan on his shoulders while my grandson laughed loudly. Vanessa looked toward him immediately. "Your mother had another confusing moment today," she said softly. Daniel's smile faded just slightly. "Mom," he said carefully, "maybe we should talk about getting you more support soon." More support. I looked at my son standing there beneath the warm kitchen lights, holding his child in his arms, and suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. Daniel was no longer asking questions because accepting Vanessa's version of me had become easier than facing the possibility that he had betrayed his own mother. The following morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped defending myself entirely. When Vanessa repeated stories about my supposed confusion, I simply nodded politely. When Daniel asked whether I remembered taking my medication, I smiled faintly and said, "I think so, dear." The change in their behavior was immediate. Vanessa became warmer almost overnight. Not genuinely warm, of course. It was the careful kindness people use around someone they no longer consider an equal. She started speaking more slowly to me. She touched my shoulder gently when guests visited. She even bought me a pale blue cardigan from a department store nearby, and said soft colors were calming for seniors dealing with cognitive decline. I thanked her graciously while something cold and sharp settled deeper inside my chest. Once people think they have power over you, they stop hiding who they really are. By Thursday afternoon, Vanessa was openly discussing my future in front of me as though I were already halfway absent. "The facility has gardening activities and movie nights," she told Daniel while chopping vegetables in the kitchen. "Honestly, Margaret would probably thrive with more structure." Daniel nodded tiredly while scrolling through emails on his phone. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I just do not want her alone anymore." Alone. That word almost made me laugh. I had spent 2 years alone after Richard died. 2 years paying my own bills, maintaining my own home, driving myself to appointments, and surviving grief without leaning on anyone. Yet suddenly, according to Vanessa's version of reality, I was incapable of existing independently. I sat quietly at the kitchen table pretending to work on a crossword puzzle, while listening carefully to every word. Rebecca from Silver Pines called again, Vanessa continued. There is an opening available next month if we move quickly. Next month. My entire life reduced to a deadline on someone else's calendar. Ethan came running into the kitchen carrying a science project made from cardboard and paint sticks. Grandma, look, he said excitedly. I made a volcano. I smiled genuinely then because Ethan was the only uncomplicated thing left inside that house. It is wonderful, I told him. He climbed onto the chair beside me while Vanessa wiped her hands on a dish towel. Careful around Grandma's tea, she warned gently. You know loud noises confuse her sometimes. Ethan looked at me with sudden uncertainty. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But I saw it immediately. A small seed of doubt planted inside a child's mind. I reached over and squeezed his little hand softly. Your volcano does not confuse me at all, I said calmly. Actually, I think it is the smartest thing I have seen all week. Ethan smiled again, but the damage had already been done. Later that evening, while Vanessa showered upstairs and Daniel helped Ethan with homework, I slipped quietly into the home office near the back hallway. Richard always believed important documents revealed people's true intentions faster than conversations ever could. He was right about that too. Inside the lower filing cabinet drawer, I found folders labeled insurance, mortgage, taxes, and finally one marked Margaret transition plan. My breath caught immediately. I opened the folder with careful hands. Inside were printed property estimates for my Hartford home, assisted living contracts, power of attorney paperwork, and handwritten notes in Vanessa's narrow script. Sell Hartford property after evaluation complete. Use proceeds toward kitchen renovation and Ethan's school fund. I stared at the page while the room seemed to tilt around me slightly. Not once anywhere in those documents was there discussion about what I wanted. Not once did anyone ask whether I intended to leave my home at all. To them, my future had already become a financial strategy. Then I noticed something else clipped near the back of the folder. A legal business card with a familiar name printed in silver letters. Martin Hale. Richard's attorney. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the basement guest room holding Martin Hale's business card beneath the soft yellow light beside the bed. Richard trusted very few people completely, but he trusted Martin. Over the years, Martin handled every major decision our family ever made. The house purchase. Richard's retirement accounts. His final will. If Vanessa had contacted him recently, then one of two things was true. Either she believed Martin would help her gain legal control over my affairs, or she had no idea what Richard actually arranged before he died. I stared at the card for a long moment before quietly reaching for my phone. It was nearly 11:30 at night, far too late to call anyone respectable, but after several seconds of hesitation, I typed a short message instead. Martin, this is Margaret Whitmore. I believe I need your help. I almost expected no reply until morning. Instead, my phone buzzed less than 5 minutes later. Margaret, I have been waiting for you to contact me. My heartbeat slowed immediately. Waiting. The word unsettled me almost as much as it comforted me. Another message appeared seconds later. Richard prepared for this possibility more carefully than you realize. Call me tomorrow morning. I barely slept after that. By sunrise, my mind felt sharper than it had in weeks. For the first time since arriving at Daniel's house, I no longer felt trapped inside someone else's version of reality. Richard had seen this coming somehow, and Martin clearly knew more than I did. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving through the kitchen while cabinet doors opened and closed in quick, irritated motions. I dressed quietly and came upstairs just after 7. Vanessa looked surprised to see me already awake. You are up early again, she said while pouring coffee into a travel mug. I could not sleep, I answered calmly. Daniel sat at the counter reading emails on his phone while Ethan ate cereal beside him. My grandson smiled brightly when he saw me. Grandma, are you staying another week? Before I could answer, Vanessa spoke smoothly without even looking at me. We are still figuring out what is safest for Grandma right now. Safest. That word had become her favorite weapon. I sat down across from Ethan and spread jam across a piece of toast slowly. Actually, I said quietly, I have an appointment in Hartford this afternoon. Daniel looked up immediately. An appointment? Vanessa's expression sharpened almost invisibly. With who? She asked. I took a sip of coffee before answering. Martin Hale. The room changed instantly. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But enough. Vanessa's hand paused around her mug. Daniel's shoulders stiffened slightly. For the first time all week, neither of them spoke right away. Why would you need Martin? Daniel finally asked carefully. Because he handled your father's legal affairs, I replied. And because I would like to review some things personally. Vanessa forced a quick smile. Margaret, maybe legal meetings are a little overwhelming right now. We could go with you. I met her eyes directly for the first time in days. No, I said softly. I think I remember how to attend a meeting by myself. Silence settled heavily across the kitchen table. Ethan looked back and forth between us uncertainly before quietly returning to his cereal. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. Well, she said brightly, that sounds productive. But I noticed how tightly she gripped the handle of her mug afterward. Daniel avoided eye contact entirely through breakfast. 2 hours later, while Vanessa drove Ethan to school and Daniel left for work downtown, I packed my suitcase carefully downstairs. I folded each sweater neatly, placed Richard's letter safely inside my purse, slipped the orange medication bottle into a side pocket. Then, before leaving the guest room, I opened the nightstand drawer one final time and found exactly what I suspected I would. A folder labeled Cognitive Evaluation consent forms waiting quietly beside the bed. I met Martin Hale at his office in downtown Hartford just after noon. The building smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, exactly the same way it had smelled 20 years earlier when Richard first brought me there to sign estate documents after Daniel was born. Martin looked older now, thinner around the face, but his eyes remained sharp and steady behind silver-rimmed glasses. The moment he saw me step into his office carrying my overnight bag, something painful flickered across his expression. Margaret, he said quietly, I was afraid this day would come eventually. I sat across from him slowly while winter light filtered through the tall office windows. You knew, I whispered. Martin folded his hands together carefully on the desk. Richard suspected Vanessa would eventually attempt to challenge your competency. Hearing the words spoken out loud made my stomach tighten again despite everything I had already discovered. Martin opened a thick file drawer beside him and removed several folders sealed with blue tabs. About 8 months before Richard passed away, he amended several legal protections surrounding your assets, he explained. Your house, retirement accounts, investment properties, and trust distributions cannot be transferred, sold, or controlled without direct verification from 2 independent physicians and your personal attorney. He paused briefly. Me. I stared at the folders silently while relief and grief tangled painfully together inside my chest. Even after death, Richard had still been trying to protect me. Martin slid another document across the desk toward me. There is something else you should know. The paper contained copies of recent communication. Attempts from Vanessa. Requests for conservatorship information. Questions about property access. Recommendations from Dr. Klein regarding cognitive decline evaluations. My hand shook slightly as I read through the pages. Dr. Klein never actually diagnosed you with dementia, Martin said calmly. He only noted concerns based entirely on information Vanessa provided. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course, she had built the entire story herself. Carefully, patiently, one suggestion at a time until even Daniel started believing it. Can they force me into assisted living? I asked quietly. Martin's expression hardened for the first time. Not even remotely. He leaned forward slightly across the desk. Margaret, legally speaking, you are fully competent, financially independent, and very well protected. A strange silence settled over the room then. For nearly a week, I had been living inside Vanessa's version of reality, so completely that I had almost forgotten my own. Martin reached into the final folder and handed me one last envelope. Richard's handwriting covered the front again in careful blue ink. For Maggie. When she finally sees clearly. My throat tightened painfully as I opened it. Inside was a short letter folded around a single photograph. The picture showed Richard and me standing outside our little cottage rental in Charleston during our 40th anniversary trip. We were laughing about something I could no longer remember. On the back of the photograph, Richard had written only one sentence. Do not spend the rest of your life begging people to treat you with dignity. I sat there staring at those words for a very long time. 3 weeks later, I stood on the porch of a small white cottage overlooking the Charleston harbor, while warm ocean wind moved gently through the palm trees nearby. The house was modest, quiet, peaceful. Mine. Daniel called 6 times during the first week after I left Connecticut. I answered only once. He cried harder than I expected. Apologized over and over. Said he did not realize how far things had gone. I listened quietly without interrupting him. Finally, he asked the question that mattered most. Can you forgive me? I looked out across the water while gulls drifted slowly over the marina below. A mother can survive disrespect, I told him softly. But surviving it does not mean forgetting it. After we hung up, I carried my coffee onto the porch and sat alone beneath the morning sun. For the first time in a very long while, the silence around me no longer felt empty. It felt honest.